He thought he was only driving his nephew to the animal shelter to drop off a donation box. He had no intention of staying longer than 10 minutes, but the moment he stepped through the side door into the kennel hallway, a small brown and white dog all shot out from behind a volunteer's legs and planted both front paws directly on his boot, looking up at him with the absolute conviction of a creature who had already made a permanent decision. And from the far end of the row, another dog sat completely still against the chain link, watching him the way a soldier watches a door he's not sure is safe to open. One chose him immediately. One wasn't sure he was worth choosing. By the time he drove home that afternoon, both of them had already begun dismantling the life he had spent 4 years carefully building into something he could survive alone. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story finds you at the right moment, please subscribe. There are more coming. Cold came early to Kelowna that October, sliding down from the Okanagan Highlands and settling over the valley like a gray wool blanket someone had forgotten to remove. The vineyards along the benchland had already gone red and gold, and the lake sat flat and pewter-colored beneath a sky that couldn't decide between clouds and clearing. It was the kind of morning that made the interior of British Columbia feel both enormous and very quiet. Colin Marsh drove his nephew's truck because his own had a slow leak in the rear passenger tire he hadn't bothered fixing yet. That was the kind of thing Colin let slide now. Not out of carelessness exactly, but out of a particular brand of indifference that came from living alone in a house where no one else noticed whether things got done. He was 53 years old, broad through the shoulders, with close-cropped gray hair, and a jaw that had been called stubborn by people who meant it kindly and by people who did not. His hands on the wheel were scarred at the knuckles, the kind of scars that came from rope and rock, and the kind of work that didn't pause to apologize for itself. His nephew, Denny, sat in the passenger seat with a cardboard box of donated blankets and towels on his lap, talking about something to do with his landlord and a broken baseboard heater. Denny was 26, lanky, with his mother's red hair and his father's habit of filling silence whether or not the silence had asked. Colin listened with about a third of his attention. The rest of him was outside, watching the lake. Denny's girlfriend Avery had organized the donation drive through her church group. Colin had been recruited to help carry boxes. He had agreed because Denny was the kind of young man who needed an older person to occasionally show up for him. And Colin understood that even when he didn't particularly want to leave the house. The Kelowna Animal Shelter sat on the east edge of town near the highway, a low beige building surrounded by a gravel lot and a row of frost-killed marigolds someone had planted along the front walk. A hand-painted sign near the entrance read, "Every animal here has a story. Please help us write the next chapter." Colin read it and thought it was the kind of sentence that would have annoyed him before. Now it just settled somewhere in his chest without moving. Inside, the lobby smelled of disinfectant and wet dog and something like old wood smoke. A woman at the front desk, somewhere in her 40s with reading glasses, pushed up into short dark hair, looked up and smiled with the practiced warmth of someone who dealt with the public constantly and still meant it. Denny introduced himself and explained about the donation boxes. While the two of them worked out the paperwork, Colin stood near the hallway that led into the kennel area. He kept his hands in the pockets of his canvas jacket. He was good at not being in the way. Then a volunteer came through the side door pushing a cart of food bowls, and the door swung wide for a moment. And that's when the dog appeared. She came from somewhere behind the cart, a small thing, maybe 12 weeks old, a Labrador mix with a sandy brown coat and a white blaze down her chest and one white front paw that made her look like she'd stepped in paint. She had enormous ears that her head had not yet grown into, and a tail that moved so fast it seemed structurally unsound. She spotted Colin's boot and made a decision about it that was immediate and apparently final. Both front paws went down on the toe of his boot. She looked up at him. Colin looked down at her. She wagged harder. Denny turned from the desk. "Oh no, what?" Colin said. "You've got that look." "I don't have a look, Uncle Colin. You absolutely have a look." The volunteer with the cart smiled apologetically. "That one's been like that with everyone she meets. No strangers as far as she's concerned." Colin crouched down. The puppy immediately tried to climb his knee. He steadied her with one hand and she bit his thumb gently, exploring. "What's her name?" "We've been calling her Penny," the volunteer said, "on account of the one white paw." He held her carefully and then set her back down, and she sat on his boot like she was planting a flag. Then he noticed the other one. At the far end of the kennel row, just visible through the door the volunteer had left ajar, a second dog sat against the far wall. This one was lean, dark-coated, some kind of shepherd mix, older than Penny by the look of him. Maybe 4 months, maybe 5. He had the long, elegant head of a working dog and ears that stood almost fully upright, and he was watching Colin with an expression that was neither afraid nor welcoming. He was simply assessing. The way dogs assess when they have learned that the world doesn't always explain itself before it changes. Colin straightened. "That one there," he said. "What's his name?" The volunteer followed his gaze. "That's Flint. He came in 3 weeks ago with Penny. Different litter, different background entirely. We don't know his full history, but whoever had him before wasn't gentle." She paused. "He's been a lot better lately. Eats properly now. But he doesn't go to people. People go to him, and even then it's slow." "Are they housed together?" They were. Penny kept crawling under his chin until he let her. The volunteer tilted her head. "He's the reason she's as confident as she is. He stood between her and anything that frightened her those first 2 weeks. We've never seen him do that with any dog before." Colin looked at Flint. Flint looked at Colin. "We have a problem," the volunteer said, and her voice had gone quieter. "Penny has 2 families interested. We'll likely have a home for her by the end of the week. Flint has had 1 inquiry, and the person decided the dog wasn't social enough." She looked at the doorway. "If we can't find someone to take him, he'll need to move to a different facility. We're at capacity. And separating them." She stopped. "Penny will be okay. She'll be okay anywhere. Flint is the one I worry about." In the hallway behind her, Flint had not moved. He was still watching Colin with that patient, unblinking attention that asked nothing and gave nothing away. Colin stood there longer than he meant to. Denny appeared at his elbow. "We should probably get the other boxes," he said, and then he looked at his uncle's face. "Oh," he said. "Oh no, we should get the other boxes," Colin agreed. He did not adopt either dog that day. He drove Denny home, returned the truck, walked back to his own vehicle, and sat in the cab for 15 minutes while the engine ticked. He thought about the tire that needed fixing. He thought about the fact that he had not eaten lunch. He thought about the empty second bedroom in his house that he had not opened since March. He did not think about 2 dogs, because thinking about them clearly wasn't going to lead anywhere useful. He drove home. His house was a 2-story property on a side street in the South Pandosi neighborhood, close enough to the lake that on still mornings he could smell the water. He had bought it 7 years ago with his wife, Patricia, who had called it a project house, and then spent 3 years turning it into something that felt like a home. She had painted the kitchen yellow. She had planted lavender along the front walk. She had put up a bird feeder outside the kitchen window and kept a running tally on a notepad of every species that visited, a habit so particular and small that Colin had teased her about it for years. He had taken the notepad down 4 years ago and put it in the drawer beside the stove. He had not thrown it out. Patricia had died of a brain aneurysm in late November 4 years back. She had been fine in the morning and gone by afternoon, which was the kind of loss that didn't build toward itself the way some losses did. It simply arrived, fully formed, and rearranged everything from that moment on. Colin had been in the middle of a phone call with his sister when the hospital rang on the other line. He had served 2 full rotations with the Canadian Special Operations Forces before Patricia got sick the first time. A scare with her heart that hadn't been the thing that killed her, but had made him step back from active service to be closer to home. He had been decorated twice, and he had learned in that career to move through fear the same way you moved through water. Not by fighting it, but by staying oriented and trusting your training. That discipline had kept him functional after she died. It had not kept him from going very quiet, very small, in a life that used to hold 2 people. He made soup from a can that evening and ate it standing over the sink. He did not turn on the television. He checked the lock on the back door, then the front, then went upstairs and lay on top of the covers with his boots still on for 20 minutes, before admitting he wasn't going to sleep and coming back down. He thought about the tire. He thought about Denny, who had texted to say he got home fine, and also to say no pressure but maybe call the shelter. He put his phone face down on the counter, and then, sometime around 9 in the evening, with the kitchen light making the yellow walls look warm, and the bird feeder outside creaking in the wind, Colin found himself thinking about Flint sitting at the back of the kennel with his ears straight up and his eyes fixed forward. Not asking for anything, just watching to see what kind of world this was going to be. Colin had known men like that, had been one of them for a while. He picked up his phone and called the shelter's after-hours line and left a message saying he wanted more information about the two dogs before anyone made any other decisions about them. He was at the shelter when it opened at 9 the next morning. The woman at the desk was the same one from the day before. Her name, he learned, was Diane, and she had run the shelter for 11 years, with a combination of organizational efficiency and genuine affection for every animal that came through. She brought him coffee without asking, a detail Colin would remember later as one of the small gestures that mark the difference between a bureaucratic institution and a place where people actually care, and took him through to the back to see the dogs. Penny remembered him. She was already spinning before he reached the kennel door, making a sound somewhere between a bark and a shout. Flint had moved closer to the front of his kennel than he'd been the day before. Just by a few feet, he sat with his front paws square, watching Colin the way he'd watched him before, carefully, without performance. Diane stood at Colin's shoulder. "He moved up," she said quietly. "Does he do that often?" "No. First time since he arrived." Colin hunkered down in front of Flint's kennel. He put his hand on the floor in front of the gate, palm up, not pressing it through the chain link. He just let it be there. Flint looked at the hand, then at Colin, then at the hand again. "Tell me what you know about him," Colin said. Diane told him. "Found in a yard in Penticton, attached to a post with wire that had cut into the skin of his neck. Young enough that the injury had healed fast, but not without leaving a small pale scar below his left ear. No record of who owned him. No microchip. He'd arrived frightened of everything that moved too quickly, and of anything that came toward him from above. He'd made progress. He ate. He slept without pacing. He'd adopted Penny with the seriousness of an animal who had decided that if the world was going to be uncertain, at least he could make it less uncertain for someone smaller." Colin listened to all of it with his hand still on the floor. At some point, without any fanfare, Flint put his nose against the gate and breathed in Colin's direction. Colin drove to the hardware store on the way home, bought 2 stainless steel bowls, a bag of puppy food, 2 leashes, and a bed the woman in the aisle said most dogs liked because of the raised edge. He paid for it all with the particular expression of a man who is not going to acknowledge what he's doing, because acknowledging it would require explaining it, and he couldn't explain it yet, even to himself. He went back to the shelter at noon and signed the papers. Diane gave him 2 collars. Penny's was red, Flint's was dark charcoal gray. He buckled Penny's on easily. She tried to eat it while he did. Flint stood very still while Colin reached for his collar, but he did not flinch, and he did not move away. He turned his head once to look at Colin's hand, then looked forward again. "Good lad," Colin said quietly, and it came out like something he'd said 1,000 times before, to men in dark places who were holding on. The first night was not peaceful. Penny had the energy of a creature who believed sleep was a personal failing, and she spent 40 minutes bouncing between the dog bed, Colin's socked feet, and a chew toy shaped like a duck that squeaked on the intake as well as the output, which seemed to delight her and slowly dismantle Colin's composure. He sat on the kitchen floor because that was where she needed him, back against the cupboard, long legs stretched out, watching her careen from one side of the room to the other, with the baffled respect of a man watching a natural disaster that was also, somehow, extremely charming. Flint lay near the back door, not tucked into a corner exactly, but positioned where he could see the door, the hallway entrance, and Colin all at once. He did not sleep for a long time, Colin noticed. He didn't say anything about it. He just stayed on the floor and let Penny exhaust herself against the duck, and occasionally he'd glance toward the back door, and Flint would still be there, watching, ears at half-mast. Around midnight, Penny finally crashed. She was asleep between one step and the next, just folded onto the dog bed with her paw over the duck like she was keeping it safe. Colin covered her with the fleece blanket Diane had sent home with them and stood up with the careful movements of a man whose knees had started issuing formal complaints sometime in his late 40s. He looked at Flint. Flint looked at him. "I know," Colin said quietly, to no one in particular. "Me too." He went to bed with the door cracked open in case either of them needed to move during the night, and he lay in the dark listening to the house breathe differently than it had the night before. It wasn't exactly comfort, but it wasn't exactly silence either. 3 weeks passed, then 4. Penny grew. She grew first in confidence, and then in noise, and then in the number of objects she considered appropriate for biting. She dismantled one of Colin's work boots. Not fully, but meaningfully. And she had a sustained campaign against the bottom stair of the staircase that Colin had privately come to think of as the siege. She had the enormous transparent joy of a young dog who had decided the world was inherently good, and every morning she greeted Colin at the top of the stairs as though he had been gone for 3 years. Flint changed more quietly. He stopped sleeping near the door after the second week and moved to a spot beside the couch, which put him closer to the middle of the room. He started eating without watching the kitchen entrance first. He still startled at sudden sounds, but he recovered faster each time. A breath, a pause, a realignment, and then he'd look toward Colin as though checking that the signal was the same as before. They had a system, the two of them. Colin had not designed it. It had simply assembled itself from the repeated vocabulary of their days. Morning walk along the creek path before the light came up properly. Flint on a long lead, nose down. Moving through the frost-killed grass with an attention that suggested he understood the world primarily through scent, and took that understanding seriously. Coffee after, Colin at the kitchen table, Flint at his feet, Penny still careening off the furniture. Evening in the chair by the window, the one Patricia had reupholstered in green fabric she'd ordered from a shop in Vancouver. Flint had taken to lying beside that chair in the evenings, close enough that his shoulder sometimes pressed against Colin's foot. Colin never commented on this. He did not want to make it into a thing that could be undone by attention. His sister, Rowena, came by on a Thursday afternoon in early November, carrying a container of lentil soup and wearing the expression she put on when she was intending to be subtle. She was 57, shorter than Colin, with the same close-set gray eyes and the same habit of going quiet before saying something that mattered. She had been the one who stayed with him the first week after Patricia died, sleeping in the spare room, not talking much, making sure he ate. She watched Penny destroy a paper towel tube with intense moral focus. She watched Flint rise from his spot beside Colin's chair, circle once, and lie back down with his chin 2 inches from Colin's boot. "How long has he been doing that?" she asked. "A while." Rowena ate her soup. "He looks like he's on duty. He might be." She glanced at Colin across the table. "You look better." Colin shrugged. "Not fixed," she said carefully. "Just better, like someone turned a light on in one room." He didn't answer, but she wasn't wrong, and they both knew it. The thing Colin hadn't told Rowena, hadn't told Denny, hadn't told anyone, was about the room at the end of the upstairs hallway. It had been Patricia's study, a small room with a window that faced the back garden, where she kept her books and her bird notes, and a drafting table she'd used for the landscape design work she did part-time before she got sick. After she died, Colin had cleared the desk and covered it. He had left her books. He had left the shelves. He had left on the windowsill a small framed photograph of the two of them standing at the top of a trail in Manning Park, sunburned and squinting into the camera, taken 12 years ago by a stranger who had offered without being asked. He had not gone into that room in 14 months, not for any particular reason he could name. It wasn't a decision, exactly. It was more like a weather system that had settled over that end of the hallway and made every approach feel like moving against a current. One evening in late November, 3 weeks after the dogs arrived, Colin heard Flint moving upstairs. He was in the kitchen washing the bowls. He heard the particular sound of claws on the hall floor up above. Penny's was always a scramble, quick and irregular. Flint's was slower, deliberate. He stopped washing and listened. He went upstairs. Flint was sitting in front of the closed door of Patricia's study. He wasn't scratching at it. He wasn't whining. He was just sitting there, upright, the way he sat when he was paying close attention to something. His ears were forward, his tail was flat. Colin stood at the top of the stairs and looked at him. "Flint," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. Flint turned his head and looked at Colin. His amber eyes held that same quality they'd had at the shelter. Patient, present, asking nothing and somehow asking everything. Colin walked down the hall and stood in front of the door. He had his hand on the knob for a long time before he turned it. The room smelled of old paper, and something faintly floral that he couldn't place for a moment, and then could, Patricia's hand cream. There was a small bottle of it still on the corner of the drafting table. He had forgotten it was there. He stood in the doorway. The curtains were the ones she'd made herself, blue linen, dark at the edges where the winter sun came in low. Her bird notebook was on the windowsill beside the photograph. A mug he didn't remember leaving was on the shelf, empty, clean, left there by someone in a hurry a long time ago. Flint walked past Colin's leg and into the room. He went to the center of the small space, sniffed the floor in a slow circle, and then came to sit beside Colin's knee. Colin felt the particular pressure of the dog's shoulder against the side of his leg, and something that had been locked up behind his breastbone for a very long time gave a sound that was barely a sound, like ice shifting in a river that has almost decided to move again. He picked up the bird notebook from the windowsill. Patricia's handwriting was very particular, small, neat, and slightly slanted, with a way of abbreviating species names that Colin had never fully decoded. He stood there reading entries from a spring 3 years before her death. Black-capped. Again. Nuthatch, pair, male-banded, hairy woodpecker, loud. 3 house finches, 2 female, notes in the margins. Colin says I should get binoculars that don't make me look like a spy. And below it, in a different pen, he's right but I'm not telling him. He sat down on the floor because standing felt wrong for what was happening. Flint lay down beside him, close against his thigh. The tears came the way they sometimes did, not all at once, not dramatically, but in a way that couldn't be argued with. Colin sat on the floor of Patricia's study with the bird notebook in his hands and cried with his head bowed and his shoulders shaking quietly, and Flint pressed the length of his warm body against Colin's side and stayed. He didn't move. He didn't try to lick his face. He just stayed. From the bottom of the stairs, Penny made a small interrogative noise, the one that meant she was wondering where everyone had gone, and then apparently decided it was fine and went back to the duck. Colin sat there a long time. When he finally got up, his knees said what they always said, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, with the notebook under his arm, looking at the room. It had not changed. It was still the same room it had always been, but the air inside it was different now, in the way air changes after a window has been opened. He left the door ajar behind him. December arrived the way it did in the Okanagan interior, all at once, with no gradual adjustment period. Snow came over the ridge on a Thursday evening, and by Friday morning the valley was white, and the lake was the color of slate, and the temperature had dropped to something the Weather Service described as brisk, which was the kind of word that people who didn't live in British Columbia applied to conditions that residents considered genuinely hostile. Colin had been walking both dogs on the creek path every morning for 6 weeks by then, and he had no intention of stopping because of snow. Flint seemed to find the cold clarifying. He moved through it, with his nose down and his ears up, and an expression of focused satisfaction. Penny had decided that snow was the best thing that had ever happened to her, and needed to eat approximately 1 pound of it before she could be convinced to go home. On the second Monday in December, Rowena called to say that there was an event at the Kelowna Legion that Saturday afternoon. A fundraiser for the shelter, a holiday meet and greet, dogs welcome, and that she had signed Colin up to attend before calling to tell him. "That's not how signing up works," he said. "It worked just fine," Rowena said. "Penny will be adorable, people will donate money. Flint might surprise you." Colin considered several responses and chose silence. "You haven't been anywhere in a month," Rowena said more quietly. "I've been to the grocery store, Colin." He looked across the kitchen to where Flint was lying near the heating vent with his eyes closed and his paws crossed, and Penny was trying to steal his tail. "What time does it start?" Colin said. The Kelowna Legion on Pandosi was a low ceilinged building with a parking lot that held 3 trucks and a bicycle in the snow, and a Canadian flag on a pole outside that moved in the wind with conviction. Inside, folding tables had been draped with red cloth, and there were donation boxes for the shelter and plates of butter tarts and squares and coffee in 3 different carafes. Volunteers from the shelter stood with dogs on leashes. A local news person with a camera tried to interview a beagle mix who was not cooperating. Penny was, as Rowena had predicted, immediately beloved. She stole a butter tart from a low table within 4 minutes, didn't eat it, just carried it around with enormous pride, and the laughter that moved through the room at that was the warm, genuine kind that loosened something in the air. An older man in a Legion jacket asked if she was available for adoption and seemed genuinely bereft when told she wasn't. Flint stayed close to Colin's left side. Not pressed against him, not cowering, but near. His eyes moved through the room the way Colin's did, measuring, organizing, looking for the shape of things. In the corner near the window, away from the main crowd, a man sat alone. He was perhaps 80, perhaps older, with the particular thinness of someone who had been strong for a long time, and was only lately beginning to show the effort of it. He wore a plaid shirt and a Legion pin on his collar, and had a paper cup of coffee on the table in front of him that he wasn't drinking. He was looking at nothing that anyone else in the room could see. His name was Art. Colin learned this later from Rowena, who knew everything about everyone in that way small city people sometimes did. Art Pedersen, 82, widower, Korean War veteran, had driven into the interior from the coast when his wife died, and that had been 15 years ago, and his daughter in Victoria called every Sunday. Flint left Colin's side. Colin noticed, because it was the first time since they'd arrived, that Flint had moved independently in an unfamiliar space. He watched him cross the room. Unhurried, direct, the way Flint did everything, and he walked to the corner where Art sat, and lay down beside the man's chair. He put his chin on his paws and closed his eyes and breathed. Art looked down at the dog for a long time. Then his hand, the knuckled, careful hand of an old man who had lived an entire life in those joints, came down and rested on Flint's head. The room around them went soft. People were still talking, still moving, still laughing at Penny's tour of the butter tarts, but that corner became quieter than the rest of it, the way certain rooms in certain buildings are quieter, because something real is happening inside them. Art said something that Colin, across the room, couldn't hear. Flint didn't move. Colin watched Art's face. The tight press of the mouth, the eyes that were suddenly wet, the slow exhale of a man allowing himself for a moment to put something down. Art's hand stroked Flint's head once, twice, and then rested there. Rowena appeared at Colin's elbow with a butter tart in each hand, and she stopped when she saw the corner, and she didn't say anything for a while. Finally she said, "How does he know?" Colin shook his head. "I don't think he knows. I think he just went. That's the same thing," Rowena said. Colin watched Flint lie still under Art's hand and felt something move through his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. Not grief, exactly. Something on the other side of grief. Something that might have been called recognition, or grace, or simply the understanding that suffering did not have to be a private room with the door pulled shut. The drive home was quiet in the way that good things were sometimes quiet. Penny was asleep in the back before they hit the first light. Flint sat upright and watched the road. Colin thought about Patricia. He did this often and had stopped apologizing to himself for it. She had been the kind of person who could walk into a room full of strangers and find within 10 minutes the one person who most needed someone to sit beside them. He had watched her do it dozens of times and had never entirely understood it. He had assumed it was a quality you either had or you didn't. He thought about Flint walking to the corner where Art sat. He thought that maybe it wasn't a quality so much as a decision, a willingness to cross the room instead of staying where you were, to move toward the quiet instead of away from it. He drove home through the snow and thought about that for a while. After the Legion event, Colin began going out more. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. He simply stopped designing his days around the avoidance of people. He took both dogs to the creek path in the morning, and sometimes he said good morning to the other people he passed, and some of them stopped to ask about Flint, because Flint was the kind of dog that people wanted to ask about, and some of them stopped to experience Penny, which was less a conversation than a weather event. He called Denny more often. He called Rowena on Tuesdays without being prompted, which she mentioned twice, and then had the grace to stop mentioning. He opened Patricia's study properly, and sat in there sometimes in the evenings with the bird notebook, reading her careful notes and, eventually, adding one or two of his own in the margin, in his own different handwriting. Observations from the feeder she'd set up, which he had filled for the first time since the autumn she died. The bird who came most often was a black-capped chickadee, regular as a clock. He told Flint about it. Flint listened with his ears slightly forward, the expression he wore when he was being politely attentive. A woman named Diane, not the shelter director, a different Diane, someone Rowena had introduced at a community dinner in January, had coffee with Colin twice in that period, and might have been the beginning of something, or might not, and Colin didn't push at either possibility, but didn't back away from it either. That itself felt like progress of a specific and important kind. Spring came back to the Okanagan the way it always did, tentatively, then all at once. Snow left the valley floor by late February and clung to the ridgeline until April, and the lake turned from slate to pewter to something close to blue. The lavender along Colin's front walk, which he had been careful to keep up because Patricia had planted it, came back in long gray-green stems with the particular stubbornness of plants that know exactly what they're doing. Penny had grown into herself. She was no longer the chaotic small creature who ate butter tarts and dismantled boots, though she remained capable of both when circumstances seemed to call for it. She was a proper young dog now, strong through the chest, bright-eyed, with a way of greeting the morning that Colin had given up finding ridiculous. She was joy made animate, and she was his, and that was a fact he had stopped inspecting too closely, in case the examining of it made it feel smaller. Flint had grown too, but into his own kind of completeness. The scar below his left ear had faded to near invisible. He slept in the middle of the room at night now, not near the door, not against the wall. He moved through the house with the quiet certainty of an animal who had assessed the place thoroughly and found it sound. At night, when Colin settled into the green chair by the window, Flint crossed the room and lay across his feet, and that was that. No ceremony, just that. On a Sunday afternoon in April, Colin sat on the back step with coffee while both dogs were in the yard. Penny had found a stick of unclear origin, and was in the middle of a complicated project involving it. Flint was lying in the new grass near the lavender, his nose up, reading the wind. Rowena was inside doing something in the kitchen, because she had arrived 2 hours ago with groceries, and the energy of someone who had plans for other people's kitchens. Through the screen door he could hear her moving around, opening cupboards with the familiarity of someone who had grown up in the same house you had, even when it wasn't that house. Colin put his coffee down on the step and watched Flint turn his head slowly, following something in the air above the back fence. He thought about the first morning he'd driven up to the shelter with Denny. He thought about standing in the hallway with his hands in his jacket pockets, not planning to stay. He thought about a small, sandy dog with one white paw and no uncertainty whatsoever, and about a dark, careful dog in the back of the kennel who moved forward 3 feet after a single night. He thought about a room at the end of a hallway that he'd been unable to open, and about the particular way a dog could sit beside a closed door without demanding anything. He thought about Art Pedersen in the corner of the Legion, and a hand finding the top of a dark head, and the way a room could go quiet around a moment of grace. Rowena came through the screen door and handed him a fresh coffee, without asking if he wanted one, which was a family trait, and sat beside him on the step. "Flint's watching something," she said. "He does that." She was quiet for a minute. "Then you seem like yourself again." Colin considered the sentence. "Not the old version," he said finally. "No," Rowena agreed. "Newer." Penny abandoned her stick and galloped across the yard to land, front paws first on Colin's knee. He caught her before she toppled the coffee. Flint stood up from the grass with unhurried dignity, walked to the step, and sat beside Colin's boot. Not on top of it. Beside it, like someone who had moved close enough and didn't need to go any farther. Colin put one hand on Flint's back and felt the long, steady breath of a dog who had learned how to exhale. He had gone to the shelter that October morning to carry boxes. He had come home with something neither he nor the dogs had a name for yet. A willingness to be found, maybe. A recognition that the locked rooms we carry inside us are not the safest places to live, no matter how long we've been paying rent on them. He had thought he was doing something for them. The truth had a different shape, the way truth often did when it arrived muddy-pawed and not especially convenient, and refused to leave until it had done what it came to do. If this story found you at the time, share it with someone you're thinking about. Tell us in the comments, have you ever had an animal or a person walk into your life when you needed it most and didn't know it? Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of grit, loyalty, and the quiet grace of second chances. Take care of yourselves out there.